Chinese-Soviet relations first went sour in 1961. There were a number of documents published by the Chinese Communist Party criticizing Khrushchev. The first document, I believe, was directed at the Italian Communist Party. It was called The Differences Between Comrade Tagliati and Us. Then they published a document called Long Live Leninism. Then they published a document called Critique of the General Line of the International Communist Movement. And then they published a document called Khrushchev's Phony Communism and Its Lessons for the World. And the Chinese were calling out the Soviet Union for holding back the world revolution, calling them revisionists. In response, the Soviet Union cut off all their aid to China, left buildings half built, devastated China economically. China was referring to the Soviet Union as revisionists, betraying the cause of global revolution. But it wasn't until about 1969, 1970 that they started calling China imperialists, saying that the Chinese started calling the Soviet Union imperialists, calling them social imperialists. Socialist in word, but imperialists. They had restored capitalism, and they were the Soviet social imperialists. After Mao died, the anti-Soviet policies escalated. In fact, China's military intervention in Vietnam in 1978 during the Kampuchea War was very much anti-Soviet. China was supporting Cambodia and Pol Pot. The Soviet Union was supporting Vietnam. So China attacked Vietnam to defend Cambodia and Pol Pot against what they called Soviet social imperialism. And you had the Kampuchea War, where Pol Pot was being supported by China, and Deng Xiaoping sent the military to Vietnam to support Cambodia. And there was that, right? And then China, though, it's important to note that after Mao died and after the Gang of Four were arrested, Chinese foreign policy did shift a little bit. When China was under the Gang of Four, when they declared the Soviet Union to be imperialist, China only had relations with Albania, right? And then, as Mao came out with what they called the theory of three worlds, China started aligning with countries they considered to be national capitalists. They aligned with Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. They aligned with the Shah of Iran. China recognized and was friendly with Pinochet. They aligned with, military regimes and juntas, Marcos in the Philippines and others, that they thought were like strong allies, an ally of China against the Soviet Union. However, after the Gang of Four were arrested and after Deng Xiaoping came to power, China started having friendly relations with Poland and Romania and other Soviet-aligned countries. China started to have a relationship with governments around the world that were Soviet-aligned. They weren't friendly to the Soviet Union, but they started getting friendlier to Eastern European countries. They started getting friendlier to countries in the so-called Eastern Bloc or behind the Iron Curtain, and trying to pull these countries away from the Soviet Union. The USA, there's a number of, writings about Romania got into debt to American banks, and so did Poland. And Poland and Romania and a lot of those Eastern European countries started becoming more and more critical of the Soviet Union and getting loans from American banks. And as these countries would get more critical of the Soviet Union, China would get closer to them. And in the 80s, China was getting closer and closer to a number of what they called the satellite countries. And this was the strategy of Brzezinski. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. He was the head of the Cold War University, they called it, or the Center of Communist Studies at Columbia University. His whole thing was, in order to hurt the Soviet Union, we need to start kissing up to countries that are aligned with the Soviet Union and pulling them away from the Soviet Union. And that's what the Carter administration did. They did the Mariel boat lifts with Cuba. Jimmy Carter sent his younger brother to go have wild drinking parties with Gaddafi. Billy Carter, Jimmy Carter's younger brother, was going and hanging out with Gaddafi. He became a lobbyist for the Libyan government, a registered foreign agent. And they were making big efforts to pull the quote unquote satellite countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union away from the Soviet Union. And you'll notice Gaddafi supported the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And China also supported the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And various countries that were part of the Eastern Bloc, part of the Soviet-aligned world, started to have distance from the Soviet Union. Ceausescu in Romania, the government in Poland. There's other examples of countries across Eastern Europe that had generally been in the Soviet camp were drifting away from the Soviet Union, and China would get friendly to them. And Deng Xiaoping would sit down and become more friendly with these leaders as they were drifting apart. China basically, they broke with the Soviet Union. They tried to be more revolutionary and more communist than the Soviet Union. They tried to have the Cultural Revolution. They tried to build a very, very egalitarian society in poverty. It didn't work. It didn't work well. And so then starting in like 1969, 1970, China started drifting into the U.S. camp in the Cold War. And it started out with, they said it was called the theory of three worlds. And it was Mao was still alive and embraced the theory of three worlds. They argued that they were the first world countries, the USA and the Soviet Union, and they were going to destroy each other in a nuclear war. And then there was the second world, which was Europe. And then there was the third world. And after the nuclear war destroyed the two major countries, right, then the third world would rise and China would lead the third world. And the non-aligned movement and the third world would lead, and China would be the leader of the third world. And so based on this theory of three worlds, based on that, China started aligning itself, making friends with various military strongmen backed by the United States that were anti-Soviet, arguing that these guys, because they were nationalists, because they were military strongmen, they weren't agents of the Soviet Union, and they could trade with China and help China develop. And when the nuclear war happened and took out the USA and the Soviet Union, then they would take China's leadership to develop. That was the theory of three worlds. After Mao died, they repudiated the theory of three worlds, and they started, basically, they were aligned with the United States during the Cold War, but they still were led by a communist party, and they started having friendly relations with various countries throughout the Soviet-aligned world that were starting to be distant from the Soviet Union. And that they were key. That was the role they played in the 80s. And then in 1989, right? 1989 is when the color revolution started happening. Czechoslovakia, East Germany, the governments of Eastern Europe that are taking out loans from the IMF and from American banks, that are having US-backed, protest movements that lead to the overthrow of the Communist Party. That's happening all across the Eastern Bloc, the color revolutions. In 1989, the summer of 1989, you had the Tiananmen Square events in China, where the same thing started happening, right? A bunch of, it started out as, again, Tiananmen Square. I mean, I can't tell this story enough. You've heard it from me before. It must be told. The Tiananmen Square events started as race riots. Look it up. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. A couple months before Tiananmen Square, before stuff started in June of 1989, in like the spring of 1989, they started having riots all over Chinese campuses. Chinese college campuses started having riots. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times was there, and he wrote about them. And what were they? They were riots against black students. China was giving a lot of scholarships to black Africans to come to China to study. And anti-communist right-wing students that were in awe of America, and they hated black people, right? And so these Chinese students that were in awe of America and wanted American capitalism and wanted American, American consumer goods, they would riot against black students on their campuses. There'd be rumors, oh my God, one of these black men is dating a Chinese girl, and there was race riots on the Chinese campuses. Right. And the culmination of the race riots, was eventually led to the Tiananmen Square protests. And this is the New York Times admitted this. They started out as race riots. Right. And no one ever wants to talk about it. They're hippies marching for freedom and all that. Started out as race riots. So there were race riots on the Chinese campuses against African students. They started lynching African students, and like the Chinese military was going to have to rescue these African students from mobs of like, young, rich Chinese kids who were in awe of America. Started out as race riots. Then from there, they occupied Tiananmen Square, and they're just saying, they want democracy. Well, what does democracy mean? The word democracy is used in the Chinese Constitution. Mao's revolution was called the New Democratic Revolution. Democracy is just a vague term. It means rule of the people. Started out with the college students who didn't like black people and liked America or whatever. Then the Maoists got involved, right? The hardliners, the Gang of Four Maoists got involved. And a lot of the workers in state-run factories who were seeing their living standards go down and their job security decreased by the market reforms, they started occupying the square. And then a couple sections of the military were in the square. And this is what happens in color revolutions. Color revolutions, it's about whatever, right? Anyone can project their grievance onto it. It doesn't matter if you're a racist or an advocate of Western capitalism or a neo-Maoist. They said there were more pictures of Mao in Tiananmen Square in 1989 than there had ever been since the Cultural Revolution. And it was about whatever. It was about everything. It was just chaos, right? It was American intelligence, George Soros and American intelligence fomenting chaos. And anyone who was mad about anything gathered in Tiananmen Square. Neo-Maoists, racists, wealthy college kids, everybody was there. It was chaos. And they sang the Internationale, and they erected a statue modeled after the Statue of Liberty, and there are pictures of Mao here. It was just a confused mess. A lot like Occupy Wall Street. It was a confused mess. What was Occupy Wall Street about? All day, all week, Occupy Wall Street. We are the 99%. It wasn't about anything, right? I was there. I was trying to make it about communism, but it was just as much about Ron Paul and libertarianism. It was just as much about Buddhism, just as much about animal rights. It's a clusterfuck. The CIA are very good at that, right? And, this is what happens when you have a color revolution. It's not about anything. It's just everyone who has any grievance, anyone who's upset about anything, there'll be some vague thing about corruption, right? Or there'll be a color, orange, or a color in Iran, it's green, right? That's the symbol of the revolution. And it's about anything, right? And that's so they fomented chaos in Tiananmen Square, right? And then Deng Xiaoping got on TV and pointed out that there had been a bunch of bombings and assassinations on the other side of the city. And he said, we're declaring martial law in the city. The students peaceably dispersed. They didn't massacre them in the square. That's been confirmed again by Nicholas Kristof, by Bruce Miles, and now by WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has leaked cables. There was no massacre in the square. There was killing elsewhere. The students peaceably dispersed from the square. That's a fact. There are multiple eyewitnesses, and U.S. media still maintains the massacre in Tiananmen Square. There was none. The students peaceably dispersed. And then, after the square was cleared, there was an armed uprising that went on in Beijing that went on for 2 weeks. And there were people on rooftops with sniper rifles, and there were people throwing fire bombs. And it was an all-out battle in the streets of Beijing between a faction, some well-embedded pro-US, pro-free market capitalism factions within the Beijing government and the Chinese military. And the military from outside of Beijing was brought in, and they suppressed it. And then it was over. And a lot of innocent people died. That's true. There were a lot of civilians who died. But there were also as many as possibly as 200 Chinese soldiers who died from the Chinese military, right? So it was a battle, not a massacre, right? There were deaths on both sides, and there wasn't mass killing in the square. This is important history. But regardless, after the Tiananmen Square event, after that, China was like, oh shit, we've been aligning with the United States because the Soviet Union stabbed us in the back. We've been helping the United States, and what happened? The United States tried to overthrow us and tried to have a color revolution against us, right? So as a result of that, Chinese foreign policy suddenly got a little bit, they backed away. During the 1990s, China and Cuba got closer, right? Cuba, the fall of the Soviet Union, right, devastated Cuba economically. But China came to the aid of Cuba. Every Cuban has a bicycle, At one point in the 90s, when Cuba, they barely had any gasoline or whatever, they gave everybody a bicycle. Where did that bicycle come from? It came from China. China supplied bicycles, every Cuban household, because they were trying to save gasoline, because the United States was preventing them from importing fuel. In the 1990s, they all got bicycles from China. And China's relationship, again, North Korea was just devastated after the fall of the Soviet Union. But China came to the aid of North Korea as much as they possibly could. They helped North Korea to some degree or other. And Tiananmen Square was kind of a wake-up call for China. But during the 1990s, China was still getting a huge amount of investment from the United States. And actually, in a lot of ways, you could argue that the opening up of China bailed out the U.S. economy. In the early 90s, they had the first jobless recovery. Google this, jobless recoveries. This had never happened before. But, as George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. was president, they had the Gulf War, the U.S. Gulf War against Iraq, and the U.S. economy had a downturn, and it hurt the U.S. economy. And that's where Bill Clinton, it's the economy's stupid and all of that. Bill Clinton came in and said the policies of the Republicans had hurt the working man. And Bill Clinton was like a new and improved Democrat who was much more free market and neoliberal oriented. And Bill Clinton came in. And as Bill Clinton came in, as China was opening up and taking more investment from the United States, the economy in the United States, you started to have the boom of the 90s, the good economic time, the boom of the 90s came in. And as the boom of the 90s came in, one thing that economists noticed, is this was a recovery. Wall Street was up again, profits were up again, but there were not more jobs. Unemployment was not changing. It was a jobless recovery. And it scared the shit out of economists. They said if Wall Street can rejuvenate, but jobs aren't coming to middle America, that means the gap is going to increase. And the USA in the early 90s had a jobless recovery. And then as, Eastern Europe opened up, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the USA is going into Eastern Europe and plundering it, and just devastating. All of a sudden, all these Eastern European countries become captive markets. In Russia, the collective farms of Russia, they all shut down. Russia's importing their food from the United States. Russia's importing its steel. The state-run steel industries are bought by American companies, and they just shut them down. Russia has to import its steel from the United States. Eastern European countries are devastated. That rejuvenated the U.S. economy. Chinese investment. And, they always talk about debt to China. Again, that was China basically in exchange for getting U.S. investment. U.S. companies coming over there. China had to loan money to the United States, right? It was almost like China was like being forced to do that. And that bailed out the U.S. economy as well. So in the 90s, China was bailing out the U.S. economy. And the boom of the 90s was very much a result of the fact that China was bailing out the United States economically in exchange for U.S. investment and U.S. economic partnerships. And that happened, right? But you have to remember then in the late 90s, you had a number of countries across Asia, right? I mean, they call them the Asian tigers, right? Taiwan, not a country. It's part of China, but it has an independent government on Taiwan. You got Singapore. You got South Korea. You got, these governments, they call them the Asian tigers. These are authoritarian Bonapartist governments, right? And Japan was heavily invested with all of them. And, these are countries that their economies had done very well. Singapore had built itself up with like a heavily state-run economy. Park Chung-hee had built up South Korea. Taiwan had built itself up in the 1980s. In the 1990s, all these countries that are part of, they call them the Asian tigers, that, Japan is investing with them. They're also tied in with China's growth. The United States realized that all those countries were not completely trustworthy, and they were getting closer to China than they were to the United States. And that, you have the incident. Well, anyway, there's other incidents that happened. There were some incidents with Singapore and some other things where it became clear that like Bill Clinton and the United States, they didn't like Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore. They didn't like South Korea. That, Shinzo Abe was in Japan, and he was moving Japan in a much more independent direction. And so in the late 90s, you had the crash of the Asian markets. which was very much engineered. All the American firms pulled their money out of the American markets and they crashed the Asian markets. And that was very much a financial attack on China. The late 90s, and as Bill Clinton's leaving office, they crashed the Asian markets. That was an engineered, that was a calculated move by Wall Street and George Soros to crash the Asian markets to attack China. And it was an attack on the Asian tiger countries, mainly on Singapore, on Taiwan. Well, Taiwan's not a country, but on Taiwan's government and economy, on South Korea, and on Japan. But it was aimed at China. It's because they were feeling like China's getting too close to these Asian tiger countries. We can't trust them. And it was a calculated move. And that was an attack on China. And then, right, as Bush comes into office, and the crash of the Asian markets is hurting the U.S. economy and all of that's happening. Then 9/11 happens. You have 9/11 and the U.S. invades Iraq. China's not supporting the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And I remember I went to an anti-war protest. I remember I was a high school student, 2005 or maybe 2006. I went to an anti-war protest in New York City. It was a huge anti-war protest, a march through New York City. The first time I'd ever been to New York City. And I walked through New York City, and it was this huge anti-war protest it was like all the Democrats, all the liberals were marching down Broadway, this huge anti-war protest that was called. All the liberals were there. And the Soros people, MoveOn.org, an organization started by George Soros, they all were handing out like water. They had these signs. They were just handing it to people. Take this sign, take this sign. And people were taking the signs. I didn't take the sign because I didn't agree with it. They were handing this crowd of people. Thousands of people were being handed signs. And what did the signs say? It said, out of Iraq into Darfur. I remember this. I was watching this. These Soros people were being paid. MoveOn.org had printed these signs, and thousands of people in New York City were being handed signs that said, out of Iraq into Darfur. Don't invade Africa. Don't attack Africa. Don't attack Iraq. Don't occupy Iraq. Attack Africa. Right? That's what they were saying. And why were they saying to attack Africa? Why Darfur? Because Sudan's government was aligned with China. And Sudan has oil, and Sudan was working with China for independent investment. So the United States and Israel had fomented a civil war, and they broke South Sudan away from Sudan, and they were trying to break the Darfur region out of Sudan. They were playing Africans against each other, Muslims against Christians. Right. And so Soros and all of them were saying, don't focus on the Middle East. Who cares about the Middle East? Focus on fighting China. And the big woke cause on all the campuses was Save Darfur. Do you remember Save Darfur? And it was all about how Sudan, the government of Sudan, is this evil authoritarian regime that's persecuting people, and they're Muslims attacking Christians, and it's the biggest humanitarian cause. We got to save Darfur. And South Sudan is basically a colony of Israel, right? I mean, the military there is completely run by Israel. I mean, the USA and Israel teamed up to break South Sudan away from Sudan. And then they worked to try and break Darfur away from Sudan. And they wanted to break apart Sudan because Sudan, the government of Sudan, was getting closer to China. Right. And so to fight China in Africa, the United States fomented civil war in Sudan. This is a fact. This is what happened. Right. And then all the stupid woke liberals. And it was funny because it was like a divide. Bush supporters and conservatives, they were going around saying we got to fight Muslims. We got to fight Islamic terrorism. We got to support Israel. But liberals that are supposed to be smarter and more sophisticated, they were saying, no. We got to save Darfur. And then there was another woke cause, the Myanmar monks, right? It was all about how the military junta in Myanmar was oppressing Buddhist monks. And all of a sudden at my college, we were all told, we need to light candles for the Buddhist monks of Myanmar. And then there were Tibet. They tried to get Tibetan separatism going again. And it was like the CIA oil banker liberals who eventually brought in Obama. They were the ones that were saying China is the threat. Whereas it was the conservatives that were saying, well, we need to focus on the Middle East. That was probably during the Obama administration, or the early Obama years, during the final years of Bush's presidency and the early years of Obama's presidency. That was the difference. Liberals wanted to fight China, and conservatives wanted to fight for Israel against Muslims in the Middle East and against Iran. That seemed to be the difference, and that was very, very interesting. And all of this was like forcing China, to become more and more anti-imperialist. During the 1990s, Jiang Zemin, who was the president of China, he said that China's goal was eventually to adopt the Western system. But as you can see, Hu Jintao started backing away from that, right? And you started to have differences within Chinese politics. There was a corrupt demagogue in China named Bo Xilai. I'm probably butchering that. If there's anyone who's Chinese listening to this, I do apologize. I don't speak Chinese. But in Chongqing, was it Chongqing? Yeah, in Chongqing, you had this guy named Bo Xilai. And Bo Xilai was a very corrupt politician who was using neo-Maoist communist rhetoric to get what he wanted, right? And so the Chinese government ultimately arrested him and removed him from power. But after they arrested him, then Xi Jinping ascended into leadership. They had a Communist Party Congress, and they brought in Xi Jinping, who was much more of a hardliner, much more of a Maoist communist. They brought in Xi Jinping because they realized that if they didn't, bring forth communism, which was the desire on the part of the party, you would get another corrupt bureaucrat like Bo Xilai. So you saw the rise of Xi Jinping in 2015. Xi Jinping rose as a result largely of the United States continuing to attack China. And what's interesting is when Xi Jinping took power in China, he made every Chinese Communist Party member watch two movies, two documentaries. The first documentary was about U.S. imperialism, and it was all about how the evil regime change wars that the United States has carried out. Great, he said there's too much pro-American, too much belief that the United States is a good country. He required every party member to watch a documentary about the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. coups. He required every member to watch it. And then he required them to watch another documentary about the fall of the Soviet Union and how the Soviet Union, the Soviet Communist Party, had been overthrown by internal confusion and by the party abandoning its communist principles, by an anti-communist faction emerging and maneuvering beneath the surface. And so Xi Jinping comes in there. He's like, I'm the new boss. And you all have to watch two documentaries, one about the evils of U.S. imperialism and another one about the fall of the Soviet Union. Boom. It was pretty clear that China was like, okay, we tried to be friends with the United States. We figured we'll keep our socialist system. But you'll let us, we'll be friendly with you. And the United States wasn't having it. And so after everything that happened, yeah, China is now moving in a very, very anti-imperialist direction, right? I mean, and China is the leader of the Belt and Road Initiative and all of that. This is important stuff that people need to know about.